So, Todd, real quick before we get driving in on this, so you've been around for a while. How long have you been doing FileMaker work?
25 years.
That's the same as me this year. So we both started at the same time. That goes way back. So what are we talking about tonight? I mean, we were talking about business before this, and now we're going decidedly more advanced in terms of the conversation, right? And intermediate developers, at least at this point. I mean, I don't want to scare anyone off. Definitely learn and understand what's going on, but my junior staff are specifically scolded not to get into SQL unless they know what's going on. So what are we talking about? What is ExecuteSQL? FileMaker is an SQL database, is it?
FileMaker SQL is not a database. It is a function of FileMaker Pro that's provided since FileMaker 12. I have a slideshow. So I'm going to just kind of roll through this a little bit. These are going to be the basics for the ExecuteSQL. So what is SQL? It's a structured query language, an international standard for database manipulation. SQL was initially developed at IBM in the early 70s, and it was used proprietary for IBM for a long time, and then it became public. What is ExecuteSQL? It is a function that allows users to perform find, searches, queries, all meaning the same thing, without the use of relationships, and it's not context specific.
So we're talking about a command that's in the scripting workspace area that we can call in FileMaker, correct? Is that with ExecuteSQL? We're talking about a script step that we call, correct?
Yeah, it's part of the calculation engine, so it can be used in a script step or it could be used in the fields. I'm going to now get into what the function is and how it performs and stuff. The ExecuteSQL parameters are the SQL query, a field separator. So when ExecuteSQL returns a result, if you're asking the query for more than one field, it needs a separator to separate those fields. And you can designate that as whatever you want. The default is a comma, but you can designate it again whatever you want. And I try to use a unique delimiter like a pipe, something that isn't normally going to be used in any text. The next is going to be a row separator, and that's defaulted by a paragraph return. And that's usually works best with FileMaker because we like to use lists within FileMaker. And when you want to go dissect the result that comes back, it's easy to use the other functions that come within FileMaker to parse that out. And there's an extra argument in there, and that is for one or more expressions to be evaluated, and it's used within the SQL statement, and it's represented by a question mark.
So I want to introduce Mike Wallace, another one of our senior engineers who's going to be potentially providing color commentary here, or various grunting noises as necessary. So in the event that you need to interrupt, feel free to grunt or something and we will know. We are, for everyone's understanding, we are broadcasting about 5 minutes away from Santa Clara's FileMaker headquarters. So we're in Santa Clara, California. And Mike's in Texas as part of our Texas office, so he's helping us out tonight.
One thing I would mention is that, or put even more focus on, is that the ExecuteSQL is a function, so it's not just limited to the scripting engine. You can put it absolutely anywhere, which could be bad. But I mean anywhere that the calculation engine is used, for example, as a tool when a tooltip fires, or when someone is on load. I mean, just anywhere, all different kinds of places, on conditional formatting, on the calculation that determines whether or not to hide or show something. All those different calculation spots could hold an ExecuteSQL command to grab data from somewhere in the system.
Okay, thank you, Michael. We're going to go ahead and move into some demos now. So I'm going to escape out of this, and I'm going to bring up this SQL database, or the FileMaker database that has SQL in it. And we are using FileMaker 14. And This comes just directly out of FileMaker. Is one of the samples. This contact database is one of the samples that come with FileMaker. And so what I wanted to do is just kind of view some real basic stuff with ExecuteSQL. I am going to go into this basic find, and I'm going to explain it. I'm setting, just so the structure for the examples tonight, I'm setting the results to a variable, a global variable, and then displaying that variable within a show custom dialog. So typically, when I'm using ExecuteSQL, I use a let statement. It gives you a lot more flexibility in structuring your SQL statement instead of, and it's easier to debug if you need to. And you'll see one debugging technique as we get into this a little bit that I use for debugging my statement. In here, so you need to have a prior knowledge of let statements and how they are used. But within let statements, you're able to define variables. And within this let statement, I have my SQL statement, which is select, which designates what fields do you want returned to you within this statement. And the from is what table occurrence do I want to perform our find or our select on. The asterisk is a wildcard within SQL that means bring all of my fields to me. That's a wildcard for everything. So this is a real basic, simple SQL statement. And then down below, I have another variable result, and it's actually performing the ExecuteSQL. And my delimiters are, my row delimiters and my record delimiters are I put in the defaults, just the comma and the paragraph return. And then it's really important to mention that there is no get last error with ExecuteSQL. You cannot return an error of any sort. It either returns nothing, which means it returned nothing, there's just nothing there to find, but your SQL statement was fine, or it will return a question mark, and that's actually your error within ExecuteSQL. So you got to look for that. And so right here I have an if statement. It says if my result is question mark or if it's empty, I return nothing. You can put whatever you want, data not found or an error. There's many combinations you can use, but for example, I'm returning nothing, or you can return the result. I'm returning the result. And so if I go ahead and I perform this basic find, let me minimize this. I might just go up into scripts and I'm going to go basic find. Oh, I got to save that. You'll see in my show message that it returned every field, blank or not blank, for every record that is in this database in the contacts.
I think what's important to understand for people is that the issue with the SQL is that FileMaker fundamentally is not an SQL database. This was added to support some advanced developers, and Mike can speak to this in a minute, but essentially there were some advanced developers who already knew how to talk or type in this language, right? I'm not one of them. I do a lot, but I'm not one of these people. Mm-hmm. And so what ends up happening is that FileMaker actually has to translate the SQL internally itself before it actually does the work. And this is kind of why we're talking about an introductory kind of session here and talking about this. And that is, FileMaker has to translate it to something it understands, then do the work, and then get the results, and then translate that back into something that SQL would understand. So people say, well, why should I use this in general? Why use this? And the answer becomes one that you can build systems without structuring additional table occurrences or relationships. So those of you familiar with our conversations and our video training about relational diagrams and perspective and anchor buoy and all this sort of stuff, you can build relationships in the SQL, correct, without actually building matching TOs and relational.
Yeah, you can go ahead and you can design very complicated SQL statements which have inner joins, unions, outer joins, which actually create that relationship within the SQL statement.
Yeah.
And it gets very, very complicated.
Yeah, and what FileMaker, it's important to understand what FileMaker says. We've had conversations where people will be demoing this, and I'll have the FileMaker engineers, sometimes at the regular user group meetings when we get to team up with DigFM and simulcast both locations, they're always shaking their head when people are like, oh, it's so much faster. It can be faster in the correct circumstance, but understand, right, strictly speaking, it's doing a find in FileMaker is faster than doing the find in SQL in general if it's on a level playing field, because FileMaker has to first translate it, then do the find, then translate it back. And so it's important to understand that. So there's benefits to using SQL for report. People talk about reporting all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Mike, feel free to chime in here.
Yeah, I actually would not necessarily agree with that 100%, that it's always faster in FileMaker. There's actually some very strong benefits to using SQL for speed, but there are certain drawbacks as well. For example, and one that's not well known is that, for example, if you have a hosted database and you have just a single record open in that database, and you perform a SQL find on the table that you have a record open in, it's really, really slow because it dumps a ton of data down from the server to compare it to your open record in order to do that find, and it actually will be massively slower. A quick commit of the record before performing that ExecuteSQL will make a dramatic difference. Another thing, real quick, is, Todd, you mentioned that there's no feedback, and that was our first impression when we started working with SQL as far as no errors and that kind of thing. But there actually, that question mark has a lot more in it than what you really realize if you have FileMaker Advanced, because there's a function somebody came up with. It's called, if you do a search for SQL.debug custom function, it's a very simple custom function that all it does is it just wraps your result says if ExecuteSQL, then return equals, if your result of your ExecuteSQL equals a question mark, then return nothing. And you would think that that would just always return nothing, but the funny thing is, when you view that in the data viewer, then it actually returns an error message from SQL. So it kind of uncovers this hidden layer underneath that when you're writing your SQL code, it will show you where you went wrong or whatever. Maybe there's something's malformed or whatever. So,
hey, Mike, I got a question. Is that error message or error code part of a FileMaker set list of error codes, or is that something specific to SQL?
No, it's specific to SQL as far as like it talks about your actual SQL code itself and what's wrong with the actual SQL statement.
All right. Well, we should definitely put a link in this video when we do the cleanup on it to make sure that we link to that site that has that information on it.
Okay. Well, thanks, Mike. I didn't know about that function, and I definitely want that link. So I'm going to go ahead and, so we just showed the basic find. I'm going to go ahead and show you what a hard code, I'm actually going to get rid of some of these, so I'm only showing you one at a time. So this is going to be, and this is typical of beginners and some intermediate developers, that they'll start hard coding fields and tables and what they're looking for within a SQL statement, and that can be devastating because a user, all they have to do is go ahead and change the field name, and then your SQL statement is destroyed and will not work. So here is a hard-coded SQL statement. I'm just saying select the field first name from contacts. So it's going to give me all the first names out of contacts. So when I go ahead and run this, here's a list of all the first names. You guys can see this, of what's in the contacts. So what I'm going to do, just to demonstrate that principle, I'm going to go ahead and go into Define Fields. I'm going to add an S to first names. I'm going to change it. And then I'm going to run that script again. And you'll see it returns nothing. So it's very important that if you are going to hard code them, we don't recommend that you do, or I don't recommend that you do, that you use them dynamically. You get your field names dynamically, and I'll show you how to do that. And then again, if I change this first name back to first, it will work again. And if I just perform this, you see that it works again. So if I go into, my next one was coding it dynamically. So what I've done is I'm getting the first name dynamically and the table dynamically. And then I'm performing my find. And so this won't matter if I change the name or not, the field name. So it goes through, it finds it. Now then, if I go ahead and I take first name and I add this S, and then I run that same one again, it works. So that's really important when you're going to use the ExecuteSQL, that you do it as dynamically as you can. That way, if you're not the only user in there and somebody goes, oh, I want to rename this field or rename this table occurrence, that it breaks your SQL stuff. And by the way, I want to reiterate that in here, in the SQL statement where it says from, it is not the table itself. It is a table occurrence. It has to be a table occurrence.
One thing that I'd like to mention, everybody has a different way of coding things. If you can bring that calculation back up again.
Go ahead.
There's one way that may be a little easier for people to see on how to grab that. You can see the name there has like contacts, : first or firsts. And you can actually just substitute that colon or the double colon for a return character. So you just do a substitute for the field, for get field name, and change it to return character. And then you can just say get the first value or the second value. First value would be the table. The second value would be the field, because you turned that field name into a list by replacing the two colons with a return character. That's just another way of doing it.
Yeah, this I just put together as simply as I could for our audience. So thanks, Mike. I wanted to go ahead and move into now sorting. Let me get rid of this dynamic one and the hard-coded one. So SQL allows you, here I'm using the dynamic structure again, SQL allows you to sort. You can, the structure is order by, and then you can sort. And that whatever you sort on doesn't necessarily have to be what's displaying in your SQL statement. I could put order by last, which is a field in here. I could do order by whatever field that is within that table occurrence. And by default, the order by is ascending and not descending. I'm not displaying it here, but you'll see where in a few others where I do display descending in here. So if it's ascending that you're wanting, you don't need to display it. So I'll save this, and then this is going to order my contacts. Now before you saw they were a mixed set, now they're ordered alphabetically the way that I wanted them. So my next example is going to be finding contacts for this state. So in other words, I'm going to find all the contacts that are part of the working address state Kentucky. So when I go ahead and I run this, it's going to give me 8. These are all the contacts for that state. And so when we go ahead and we look at this script, so all I did is I added state as a variable, cleaned it out, and so I'm saying select first name from the table, which is contacts here, and where, and I have state. And look, there's that argument that I was talking about in the beginning. It's a question mark. And what that question mark is referring to is a field on my record, which is highlighted right here within my execute SQL statement. It's noteworthy to know if you use multiple question marks within your statement, they have to be listed in the correct order within the SQL statement, the execute SQL statement. If I had another question mark in here and I actually wanted to use work state again, I'd actually have to list it again for the second question mark. It's a mistake that I made when I was first starting, so I just thought I'd shoot that out there. Okay, so another example is what we're going to talk about here is grouping. So in my statement here, I'm using a group by, and what that does is that allows you to do like a sub-summary. So that's the FileMaker counterpart to a SQL statement. It would be group by. So I'm going to run this, and what I'm doing is I am counting. So I added a function in here. So I'm going to count. Let me run through the whole statement. I'm selecting the state, and then I'm counting all the first names from contacts, and I'm grouping it by the state. So I'm grouping it by the working state. So when I run this, oh, and what I wanted to mention, I'm going to do this. This is one of my debug tools. Right here, I use the list function, and I go ahead and I list my query statement and my result. That way I can see that my query statement or my select statement is properly formatted. I'll just uncomment that for this one. Yeah, go like this. Actually, I'm going to just comment out the if statement. And then I'm going to run this. And so you'll see my select statement at the top and how it's formatted. I can make sure that it's correct, and I get my results displayed. And you can see that, you know, all my states are in a random order basically, but it's giving me the results. And if you look down at Kentucky here, it says 8, and those are the 8 that I had found when I did a find for all the contacts for that state, which was Kentucky at that time.
I have a little thing to add for any super geeks that are out there. I actually used a function like this with the group by, because in SQL you can actually add in different little, well, you can format it instead of just like a comma there, you could have it formatted however you want. And so I actually had it put it out in a format of $$, and for example, it would be the state in this case, and then it equals, and then whatever that summary data was. And then that, if you look at it, you could see in the list, it looks like a let statement, like you're setting a bunch of variables, just like you did in this let statement, where it has first equals and table equals. And then so that allowed me to create a bunch of variables dynamically by just evaluating that whole thing in a let statement. And so that went over a lot of people's head, I'm sure, but for people, those who got it, it's a nice extra tool that you can do to actually grab the SQL data. And one of the things I think we are kind of missing here is why to use SQL. Because when you when you have SQL, it's just returning it's a block of text. So what good is that? But it actually can be very useful for doing things like setting up a sink where you need to grab a block of data and transfer it or something like that, or if you just need to do something like Richard has a video that we did together on virtual list techniques, where you're grabbing a bunch of data and putting it into variables and such, so you can display a report that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do right out of FileMaker. So there's a lot of different reasons to grab a chunk of data and be able to do something with it. And
Mike, can I interrupt you right there? That is a good point. In FM Starting Point, we're using virtual lists. There's a function within FM Starting Point that's advanced find, and it's in the preferences. You can click the yes button, and when you go to find in invoices or products, you can click the find, and it uses the ExecuteSQL to find and set the results that you perform your find on. So that's using ExecuteSQL.
So this is where we call a timeout, and we have to ask the question, why did we do this? I mean, you guys came to me and said, hey, we really want to put SQL in the FM Starting Point, and I went, it's not like for beginners, right? So why is it there? Explain what the point is and what your argument was to me about why it should be in there.
It's very modular. When you go and create new like anchor buoy systems, or you're using that structure, it's very simple to set up. You're copying a table, setting a variable, and you're done. That's after the initial setup. And then the time it takes to go ahead and set up all the other TOs that you need to set up to do the find and the layouts, you don't need to. You're copying over popover, you're adding the variable, you're adding one relationship, and then you're done. That's how simple it is.
Another thing is, just in general, using ExecuteSQL opens up a lot of modularity, where you can build code that you can drop into any database and it will just work with just using the layout that you're on, etc. FileMaker has a whole set, actually two main tables, which is your list of all the different layouts. And are you going to be talking about this in one of your things about the layouts and the fields and such that you can query?
Yes, I have two demos.
Okay, so I'll let him talk about that, but just a quick touch on that. The nice thing about it is, for example, there's no function in FileMaker to get the base table of whatever section you're in. For example, I'm on a layout, I can get the TO, I can get the layout name, but I can't get what is the base table that this information is coming from. But you can actually get the TO name and then use that in a SQL query to say give me all the TO, or the main table, the base table, where TO equals where I am. And that will give me my base table name. So no matter what somebody changes a TO name to in the database, I can always know that I'm on contacts, for example, whatever my base table is.
And I can run into that example right now because it seems just like a good time to do that. So in FileMaker's relationship graph, there are shadow tables that you don't see. And two of those shadow tables is a FileMaker underscore tables TO and a FileMaker underscore fields TO. So you can't see them, but you can run ExecuteSQL against them. And so it's a really simple, I just did a plain ExecuteSQL, no let statement or anything, just to demonstrate this. And this is going to return very limited data because it's only contacts, but I'll go ahead and run the table one, and you'll see what you get. It returns the table name, the table ID, the base table name, the base file name, and the modified count for all the tables. And we only have one, so that's the only thing that's being displayed.
I want to introduce an additional senior engineer who is dying to comment. I'm getting taxed over here on my instant messaging. Steve Allen, you guys make sure you unmuted Steve Allen. Steve, are you there?
I'm here.
All right, great. So Steve was texting me and commenting back and forth. So now we have 3 of our CC senior engineers all here tussling a bit. Go ahead and repeat what you were just sitting there saying.
I was basically summarizing kind of, I think, what Todd and Mike were getting to in the most recent comments, and that was that there's really 2, and Todd was starting to outline a 3rd, primary reasons to use ExecuteSQL. First of all, we covered briefly in the beginning, and that is performance. Performance is kind of tricky because with great power comes great responsibility, and this is a very powerful tool, and it can totally screw up your database if you're not careful. The second reason is modularity. And the benefits of modularity are very real, but they're also very hard to convey to someone who hasn't seen it in action. So I think Todd and Mike did a pretty good job of outlining that. Basically, modularity means I've written code once, and I can copy-paste or import or whatever, and be very short time to live after I've written it the one time for any new deployment of it. The third one, Todd, I think, is outlining right now, and that is getting into areas that are hard to get into otherwise. So that was my summary.
Thank you, Steve.
No problem.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and let's view the second one, which is the tools, just so we don't get too far away from the point. Let me go ahead and just run this, and you'll see what you get. So this is, I think, more of what Mike was talking about. It returns a list of all the underlying base tables for all table occurrences in the current file. And it just returns the result of all those. So there's some data that you can get to that isn't normally displayed. And you can use it dynamically, as Mike was talking about. So I only have one more example that I'd like to show you.
Todd, one more thing about that. The count that you showed there is also something you can use to test, for example, versions of something. If you tested every table and got it's basically how many times has it been modified. That's what that count is. And so you could actually add that number up for all tables and come up with a single number that says this database has been modified in the structure of the database or not, from the last time that I worked with this. So.
Right. Thanks, Mike. So I'm going to digress a little bit and go back to when we were counting the first names per state, and kind of like what Mike was talking about, we're taking a found count for each state and using that as kind of a sub-summary, and that's very useful in reporting. This one, all I'm doing is I just added a order by, so I wanted to order the states. The last time we ran this, the states were kind of mixed up in a random order, and I just wanted to order these so they're descending. Or actually, I'm sorry, they weren't not sorted group by, sorted them for us, but they sorted them alphabetically, and I wanted them descending instead. So in order to do that, I put an order by statement in there, and you have to designate it either, well, in this case, we have to order it DESC, which stands for descending. So let me just run that so you can see the results of that. And yes, I have to save that again, and you'll see that it just reversed them. And so this is, like Steve was saying, it is a very powerful tool. I wanted to comment a little bit about where I use this and where I don't use this. I don't use it actually on a large set of records, and the reason is it slows down the find dramatically. I don't know what the breaking point is, but in FM starting point, I think we limited it to 20,000 records, and after 20,000 records, it actually turns off the advanced SQL finds. What we could have done if it was served, we could set that SQL statement, put it on the server using server-side scripting, and return the result, and that would have been fast. And it's actually wicked fast when you put it on the server. I'm doing some reporting for a client right now, and I went ahead and did some reporting that showed some graphs, and then I did it just locally, and it was like taking like 45 seconds to run. I moved that over to server side, and it took 5 to 9 seconds to aggregate all that information that they're looking. They're looking through a year's worth of data. So there was more than 20,000 records that it was searching through. But you have to, as a developer, know your system, know what the limits are, and where to use it. It doesn't have any straight cutoff points. It's developer designed. So one of the other things you want to do is you want to make sure the fields that you're finding on, just like in FileMaker, are indexed. If they're not indexed, it's going to slow it down dramatically. And some of the other places, like Mike was talking about, we were talking about earlier, was you can use it in lookups. I use it a lot of times when I don't want to create one TO for performing one function or one lookup. It seems a waste of space within my relationship graph. And so to keep it cleaner, I use the SQL statements. We already covered the invisible shadow table, so I'm not going to run over that. I do want to run into some of the references that I do use when I'm going to put this up on the screen because it is right here. I use the missing FM12 ExecuteSQL reference guide. There's the link if you want it. Seed Code came out with an additional, or like an addendum to this, where in 13 we introduced new clauses. It's offset and fetch first. Really handy things, especially for navigation of your data if you want to use that. And then if you want to download the Seed Code Explorer, C-Code SQL Explorer, that will give you really good experience with how to develop SQL statements from basic to complex, and I really recommend that. But my go-to is this missing FileMaker 12 SQL statement references. I can display it a little bit just to give you an idea of, it kind of covers everything. That is the clause. This is the SQL reference from FileMaker Hacks. Very good website. You can just go through and it just runs you through the beginning and how to do it. This is actually the document that I used to start learning the ExecuteSQL. And you can see by what they have listed here how complex a SQL statement can get. You can also do conditions within SQL statements. It gets very complex. But that's what I have to offer you as far as references. So enjoy, and I'm glad I was able to share.
Well, I want to thank Beverly Boff for all the work that she did, and Kevin Frank as well, because Kevin runs the FileMaker Hacks website, and Beverly wrote that document, as well as the folks of Seed Code. They won an award actually a little while back for that solution, so it's important to know that they've won an award actually for helping people learn about SQL. That's very important. So that's a good way to start things off. So we've got two important topics for everyone to see and consider. So once again, this is Richard Carlton. Welcome to FMPug Without Borders, the user groups where you live doesn't really matter.